Hammer of the Emperor. Each of the manifold horrors of the galaxy is enough to drive a human insane. Xenos monstrosities, otherworldly sorcerers, and unholy aberrations from darkest nightmare plague mankind. Against everything that threatens humanity's survival stand the massed ranks of the ASTRA MILITARUM. In a galaxy sometimes without light and often without hope, they fight and die that others shall not. From the million worlds of the Imperium, their immense armies march endlessly to war. Countless soldiers, heavy battle tanks, thunderous artillery, and sky-darkening flights of gunships are commanded by iron-willed officers whose chain of command is ruthlessly enforced. Not for naught is the ASTRA MILITARUM known as the Hammer of the Emperor. Occasionally unwieldy, often indiscriminate, it is the Imperium's weapon of total and unrelenting force. To be a soldier in one of the ASTRA MILITARUM's unnumbered armies is to be one amongst hundreds of thousands of all too mortal warriors. Yet it is also to be a part of humanity's greatest ever war machine, and to lend one's faith, strength, and hate to that engine of devastation as it crushes all before it through sheer brute force. Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and phases of the Warhammer 40k setting, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace. There is only time for war. If you wish to see the channel flourish and possibly take on bigger topics and get better resources, then like and subscribe, but also consider joining our Patreon or throwing a one-off tip in the form of a super thanks, if I have indeed earned your bounty. And today, as I ease back into things and work on larger entries, we shall be taking a swift look at the 10th edition update for the ASTRA MILITARUM, the Emperor's Hammer, his Imperial Guard. There are two story elements from the newest Codex and the update for the era Indomitus. Alas, I'm not going to comment too much in this entry, as I am working towards covering the greatest of all Imperial Guard regiments. You know the one. So do bear with me as I narrate this one out. And so, let us begin. To quote, standing at the observation slit of his command bunker, Colonel Kurz, service numeral LK714/9G of the 413th Siege Regiment, looked down at the chrono. Brushing a layer of ash and grime from its readout with a gloved right hand, he checked the time. The first wave remained on schedule. He heard the distant boom of artillery pieces ripple from the rear of the Death Corps lines. Raising a pair of battered magnoculars, Kurz peered down into the Krieg trench lines laid out before the command bunker. Masked and armoured grenadiers shifted impatiently in position, heads down, braced for a thunderous barrage to come. Great-coated soldiers placed ladders against the tip of the trench, whilst commissars and officers stood ready. Some carrying loudhailers, others grasping chainswords and pistols. He adjusted his gaze to the scarred earth that separated the Krieg positions from those occupied by the traitors. It was a muddy expanse of ruined vehicles, scorched tree trunks, razor wire, and shell craters. Despite being only a few hundred yards across the mire, the heretic positions were obscured by chemical haze. "Steady! Preparatory barrage incoming!" bellowed a commissar in the eerie silence. "Stand ready!" Kurz heard the rumble of artillery batteries. Dust shook loose from the bunker's thick ferrocrete ceiling. The first volley of shells whistled overhead, arcing towards the traitors' positions. The sound of the thunderous impacts rattled bones and shook the earth loose from the wooden walls of the trenches. Pools of toxic effluent that filled deep craters rippled as the round struck home, A second barrage landed, this time further away, creeping over the enemy line. Explosions rippled across the battlefield as ammunition and promethium detonated. Kurz hoped the effect upon the defenders had been as impressive as it looked. The grenadiers remained silent, waiting for the barrage to end. Then, in a violent crescendo of smoke and shrapnel, the third and final volley struck. Hovering servo skulls emitted high-pitched screams from their voxcasters. Death Corps soldiers emerged over the lip of the trench, climbing wooden ladders and striding out into the miasma of lethal gas that permeated Septemvirta's ashen wastes. The troops marched forward in order, never sprinting or breaking formation, bayonets fixed, trudging with a grim defiance that Kurz was sure would have made even the Emperor proud. He measured their progress against the range markers of his magnoculars display, green numerals flashing brightly over the static-laced visuals. 20 yards they strode, then 30, plunging through a toxic haze of ash and filth thrown up by the preparatory barrage. Kurz glanced at his chrono once more and gave a satisfied nod. The first wave was on time. Sergeant Tyborg, serial number X511Z/46, clambered up the rickety wooden ladder and followed his squad out into the miasma of no man's land. The Krieg soldiers managed to advance a few dozen yards before the first traces of sporadic fire erupted from the enemy positions. Through the smoke he could see the muzzle flare of heavy stubbers and the pinprick flashes of lasgun bolts lancing forwards to strike the first rank of grenadiers. The blind fire was not precise, but accuracy was hardly required in such a killing field. Krieg soldiers fell, bodies riddled with impact wounds. On the remainder strode, heedless of their fallen. The haze was lifting, revealing the enemy's position. He could hear the heretics bellowing orders to one another, their voxcasters screeching blasphemous prayers. Fresh craters covered the approach, with large sections of razor-wire defences blasted into ruin by the impact of the creeping barrage. Death Corps engineers crouched in the dirt, cutting additional routes through the wire and clearing minefields. In several positions, the enemy's forward trenches had been blasted open, the body parts of their occupants strewn all around. Still, the remaining heretics kept up a prodigious rate of fire, inflicting terrible losses on the advancing Death Corps soldiers. Mortar shells began to rain down in the midst of the advancing column, spraying lethal shards of glowing shrapnel through the Krieg ranks. Thankfully, the groans of the wounded and dying were largely drowned out by the deafening report of heavy guns. Tanks rumbled forward beside the Death Corps infantry. Battle cannons roared and metal tracks tore through the mire, grinding over the bodies of the dead and wounded. Bone and armor cracked under the relentless steel tread. Rattling stubber and staccato autocannon fire from the heretic positions deflected from the sloped armored plating of Lehman Russ tanks with audible pings and screeches. Las cannons found their mark, shearing a track from the lead tank and piercing the hull of a second. Fire licked from the vehicle's hull as burning tankers hauled themselves from hatches, screaming as they fell to the ground and rolling desperately from side to side in vain attempts to extinguish the flames. The man to Tyborg's left took a lasgun round to the knee and toppled into the mire. A burst of heavy stubber fire felled another to his right. The Death Corps soldiers continued forwards without so much as casting a glance towards their stricken companions. Tyborg drew his bolt pistol from its holster and followed the squad of grenadiers forward, slipping into the quagmire base of a shell crater. The first enemy trench lay no more than a few feet beyond their position, close enough for him to hear the guttural cries of the heretics over the whip crack of lasgun fire. The Death Corps soldiers scrambled through the cloying mud, grasping for handholds as they hauled themselves up the far side of the crater. Mortar shells rained down, deep sonic whistles audible before the heavy rounds exploded in the muddy ground, shrapnel scattering Krieg soldiers. A dozen or more Imperial guardsmen were clustered around Tyborg now, struggling forwards, hemmed in on all sides by enemy fire. Several attempted to leave the crater, rising above its lip only to be struck down by a hail of bullets, bodies falling backwards to impede the remaining soldiers. The advance had begun to stall. Frustration gnawed at Tyborg as he looked down at his muddy chrono. They were behind schedule, and throwing himself into automatic fire wouldn't achieve a victory. He turned to the Vox carrier. "Hail the armor! We need supporting fire!" Standing in the cramped turret of his Lehman Russ tank, Gunner Dovon, serial number DR193/LK2, activated the traverse mechanism, tracking enemy infantry with a coaxial stubber. Tracer fire raked the trench line, causing a group of traitor guardsmen clad in mud-brown flak armor to duck for cover. Return fire, autocannon judging by the sound, slammed into the hull of his tank, caroming from its thick armor. "Infantry pinned down ahead, traverse to 30 degrees, traitor stubber position," came the voice of the tanker's commander, Sergeant Stagmar, over the internal Vox system. Gunner Dovon wrestled with the traverse controls and panned the stabilized gun to the left. Pressing his eye to the sight, he saw a group of grenadiers crouching behind the lip of a deep crater. Several dead bodies lay in the base. He saw the muzzle flare of a heretic stubber, concealed behind sandbags in an elevated position, raining fire upon the pinned grenadiers. He heard the heavy clang as the carousel autoloader moved another weighty shell into the breach. Rune displays flashed green, indicating ready status. "Gun laid on target," he growled into the Vox bead. "Fire!" ordered Stagmar. Dovon closed his hand around the firing lever, whispering a rhythmic prayer for accuracy, and yanked backwards. The battle cannon roared, its recoil shaking the Lehman Russ on its tracks. The shell slammed into the sandbags and detonated, igniting ammunition and causing a crackling fireball explosion that consumed the heavy stubber and crew. "Good effect! Target neutralized," Stagmar said. "Driver, forward!" Through the gunner's sights, Dovon watched as the grenadiers clambered out of the crater and covered the last few yards towards a heretic trench, tossing frag grenades into the enemy positions as they ran. Some fell, las gunfire from the defenders cutting them down before they could bring their bayonets to bear. Dovon depressed the trigger of the turret's coaxial stubber, spraying the enemy lines with bullets, and was rewarded with bright puffs of gore as the heavy rounds found their mark. The tank ground forward over the dead and dying. Dovon felt little sympathy for those crushed beneath the weight of the vehicle. Their fight was over anyway. "Enemy armor cresting ridge at 310. Traverse left." Stagmar's voice carried a trace of panic this time. Dovon wrestled with the turret traverse again, bringing the heavy cannon around as the driver adjusted the tank's facing. His sight settled over the jet-black bulk of a traitor tank, its armor emblazoned with red sigils and festooned with macabre trophies. Its turret was already leveled towards them. The autoloader whirred again. Dovon placed a trembling hand upon the firing lever and prayed to the god Emperor. Through his magnoculars, Colonel Kurz saw the traitor armor crest the ridge beyond the enemy trench and grimaced as their cannons flared. He watched the last remaining tanks of the 12th platoon erupt into flames or come grinding to a halt, their hulls blasted open, leaking fuel and smoke. He winced involuntarily. Without armor support, the first wave was doomed. "First wave casualties estimated at 75% and increasing," said his adjutant, voice slightly muffled by his rebreather hood. Kurz lowered his magnoculars and drummed a gloved finger against the bunker's ferrocrete wall as the slaughter unfolded before him. The grenadiers at least had reached their objective, traces of lasgun fire from the enemy trenches betraying the ongoing fight. How long they could hold their position, he had no idea. He glanced down at his chrono again and waved his Vox operator forward. "Contact the batteries. Prepare smoke barrage. Second wave assault to commence forthwith," he ordered. Gazing out at the field of broken bodies and smouldering wrecks, Colonel Kurz gritted his teeth. He still had 4 companies in reserve. If the foe thought the resolve of the Death Corps had been broken, they would soon be disavowed of this belief. The Era Indomitus. humanity's response to the cataclysm of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the outpouring of heretics, the surges of mutation and Xenos aggression, was not the spiteful lash of a dying beast. It was the roar of a titan on the warpath, and its manifestation was arguably greater than the mythic battle groups and armies said to have been loosed in the Great Crusade. Millions of guardsmen had fallen on Cadia alone. Countless more were wiped out with the tearing open of the Great Rift and the eruptions of warp storms old and new, or perished fighting the hellish enemies that had boiled out of their depths. The fate of half the galaxy, designated the Imperium Nihilus, remained unknown beyond the Great Rift, while threats of every conceivable evil assailed thousands of systems within the Imperium sanctums. Everywhere it seemed to the overburdened staff officers and lords general of the ASTRA MILITARUM, warzone commanders demanded urgent logistic support and mountains of additional ammunition, cried out for desperately needed reserves, or worse, fell ominously silent. Tithes were increased on already suffering worlds. Vicious conscription drives emptied entire hive cities. Heightened output needs pushed industrial worlds to their limits in desperate attempts to make up for shortfalls. Each ASTRA MILITARUM regiment, the total forces of a given world that fall under the remit of the ASTRA MILITARUM, was stretched to breaking point. The Indomitus Crusade. Rabute Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade was but one answer to the hurricane of woes that beset him daily as Lord Commander of the Imperium. Between Guilliman, his senior commanders, and his army of bureaucrats in the Officio Logisticarum, the laborious effect of gathering the Crusade fleets began. To secret mustering points throughout the Sol system and beyond, thousands of regiments converged, joining with Space Marines, Sisters of Battle, the cybernetic hosts of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and more. Yet this was only the beginning. Each fleet's battle group, once launched, fitfully made their way through the churning warp on predetermined courses. Where they came to systems miraculously spared carnage, they each reaped a harvest of yet more regiments. Where their task forces found worlds in the grip of invasion, the Imperial Guards regiments of massed infantry, battle tanks, and artillery almost always formed the vast majority of every Crusade force. In the wake of each victory, reinforcements from the recently saved world were demanded. The fleets of the Indomitus Crusade continue Guilliman's vision of pushing back the corrupting armies of chaos and those enacting Xenos tyranny. Guilliman's objectives stretched beyond mere attack, however. His Officio Logisticarum was granted the authority to requisition tithed regiments for the protection of its adepts and their hub fortresses, and senior ASTRA MILITARUM officers were ever amongst the luminary nobles and warrior generals assembled by the Indomitus Crusade. Several were appointed by Guilliman to command entire battle groups and even fleets, such as the dynamic leader of Fleet Tertius, Fleet Master Van Lescas, formerly a hereditary general, or Marca Gur of the Vodine Segeste regiments. War without end. The demands the Indomitus Crusade placed upon the ASTRA MILITARUM were unparalleled. As the battle groups moved from system to system, they subsumed innumerable regiments to replace their losses and swell their combat assets. Many regiments were also deployed to the Officio Logisticarum's hub fortresses in the Crusade's mustering sites, and commanders were instructed to found new hub fortresses in conquered systems. Guilliman's ambitious aims for the Indomitus Crusade were vital for the Imperium's future, but the battlefields its fleets were destined for made up only a fraction of the war zones the Imperial Guard fought in. Within subsectors that lay nowhere near the path of any Indomitus battle group, ASTRA MILITARUM forces were dispatched to new or escalating warfronts daily, coordinated by the masters of localized Departmentum Unitorum officios and their armies of scribes, adepts, logisticians, and strategos. Infantry regiments, armored bastions, artillery divisions, and super-heavy tank companies were constantly deployed and redeployed, reinforced, consolidated, or evacuated. The grinding logistics involved in moving huge numbers of troops and materiel through storm-tossed warp channels only compounded this undertaking, adding further dangers and delays. Xenos invasions were confronted, Orcs and Tyranids in the Octara sector, Necrons in the Irenaeus cluster, Eldari raiders in the Deshkar subsector, to name but some. Multiplying cult uprisings were crushed and uprooted, some in the thrall of the dark gods of chaos, others bearing Xenos mutations or ideas, or fighting for secessionist tenets fueled by political or religious heresy. Only 3 of the 5 lords of the Segmente Majoris were in tentative contact with the wider Imperium. Of these, Leontus, the Lord Solar, was arguably the most embattled. The Segmentum Solar, home to Terra itself, was assailed from without by heretic fleets and countless Xenos, and from within by insurgents and traitors. Leontus refused to allow such threats to come to fruition under his watch. Lord Solar Leontus. Arcadian Leontus, his dazzling tally of titles, privileges, and ostentatious ranks, placing him amongst the Imperium's highest echelons, is responsible for all ASTRA MILITARUM within the Segmentum Solar. He hails from one of Terra's noblest families, one with a peerless lineage of service dating back countless generations. A product of Terra's opulent spires and greatest military academies, Leontus is steeped in the political and martial skills needed to survive on and off the battlefield. Even after the loss of billions of soldiers to warp storms, combat attrition, or calamities unknown, the Militarum Regimentos at the Lord Solar's command have been depleted still further by the Indomitus Crusade. He would never gainsay the Primarch's directives, but within their parameters, Leontus has emerged victorious from many political battles with planetary lords, Navis Imperialis admirals, and Officio Logisticarum adepts. With the aid of entire corps of strategic advisors, cloisters of priests, and a personally maintained stable of seers, prophets, and tarot readers, known as the Collegiate Astralex, Leontus has masterminded hundreds of stunning victories. As he sees them, the Lord Solar's duties lie first with the defense of the throne world, then the solar system, then its neighboring subsectors and the Segmentum's wider frontiers. A war scholar, polyhistor, and martial tactician of the highest caliber, the Lord Solar's razor-sharp intellect and energetic leadership belie his extensive combat experience of more than a century. Regimens of costly rejuvenate treatments, alongside suites of concealed bionics within his polished armor, keep Leontus at his physical peak. Outside battle, however, he endures a weariness of spirit, privately appalled at the horrors he sees perpetrated by the Imperium upon its people. He has authorized many himself, having sent millions of Imperial guardsmen into the most terrifying conditions. But Leontus sees such steps as distasteful necessities on a path to ultimate salvation. With grim pragmatism, the old soldier who knows he will not see the hoped-for destination of his works. For him, it is enough that he paves the way. Though Leontus's remit technically ends at the boundaries of the Segmentum Solar, he has led several campaigns beyond. The Lord Solar sees the myths of Saint Macarius as precedent for this. If prosecuting distant wars will protect Terra, Leontus will not shirk from such duty. The outbreak of the Fourth Tyrannic War saw him rush to the Bastur subsector to marshal its defences. Astride his cybersteed, Constantine, the Lord Solar inspired the defenders of Sanctum with rhetoric and valour in equal measure. Corporal Dran held his lasgun in trembling hands, casting a wide-eyed gaze across the bombed-out cityscape that lay before him. His 3 remaining squad-mates moved into position at his side. They had taken cover in the hollowed-out ruin of a hab block. The ceiling and facade of the structure had been fractured by the invaders' precise orbital barrage, leaving only a low wall behind which to cover. Gerrit, the rawest member of the squad, pawed at his helmet, unfastening the leather chin strap and breathing heavily. "Where's Sarge?" he asked, clearing sand from his lasgun. dead," answered Trooper Orvon. Enemy munitions continued to streak down, few in number, but unerringly accurate. In the aftermath of each impact, screams of pain and the crackle of burning munitions could be heard. Around the blasted bunker in which Dran's squad had taken cover, Cadian soldiers rushed to seek shelter from incoming fire. Dran could hear the cracks of lasgun fire and the high-pitched whine of the Xenos invaders' guns as they pressed their assault. "Quiet!" Dran barked, peering through the gathering sandstorm. "What in Throne's name are they?" Garrett whined, rising to train his gun down the road. "Xenos," Dran replied sharply. Trooper Irons, a grizzled veteran whose ragged beard spoke to the length of his deployment, remained uncharacteristically silent, sitting with his back against a low wall to Dran's right and wiping down the cooling shroud of his melter gun with a rag. "Any word from command?" said Dran, turning to Orvon, who bore the squad's Vox unit upon his back. He shook his head. "Then we follow orders. Hold position." Garrett let out a frustrated sigh. "Without armor support, we're finished." "You were dead the moment you put on the uniform, get it? Get used to it," Irons replied dryly. Dran ignored the back and forth between his squad mates, focusing his attention across the roadway. Through the dust clouds, he caught a flash of movement, something lithe and swift, scurrying through the husks of burnt-out buildings. He snapped his lasgun into position. "Weapons ready! Enemy infantry incoming!" he shouted. The troopers shifted into firing positions, lasguns resting atop window frames and scrap metal, wide eyes scanning for movement. Dran could feel his hands trembling. He swallowed hard as he fought to steady the wavering muzzle of his weapon. He could see more shapes moving, darting between cover. He felt his weapon vibrate and heard the soft thrum of engines. A volley of fire ripped across the roadway from the Xenos' positions, scything through the dust storms to slam into the stone walls and deflect from scrap metal obstructions. Dran ducked involuntarily as the shimmering projectiles whistled overhead. To the east and west, he could hear lasgun fire as the enemy assault reached the first line of defenses. The Xenos soldiers rushed forward in small bands, all clad in bluish, form-fitting armor with long power weapons and pistols grasped between slender digits. The majority wore conical helms, the lenses of which glowed red. The figures darted across the roadway, bounding strides carrying them swiftly towards Acadian positions. Drawing a bead on one of the aliens, Dran squeezed his lasgun's trigger. The Xenos reacted swiftly, darting aside. He fired again and again, his final shot hitting the target. The bolt burned through the Xenos' breastplate, and it fell. Dozens more followed, their lilting battle cries filling the air. An armored sentinel lumbered into position beside the bunker, its autocannon spooling up with a loud rattle and glowing red-hot as it spat armored-piercing ammunition into the Xenos. The first wave of blade-wielding enemies ducked behind cover and began snapping off shots with their pistols. Beyond them, Dran could see the ominous shadows of hovering tanks drifting into position. More armored warriors sprang swiftly out of the vessel, bringing with them floating weapons platforms. "Armor! Irons! Get that melter forward!" Dran barked. The hovering vehicles drifted closer, their turrets spitting laser fire and searing beams of blinding light into defensive positions. Dran reeled, shielding his eyes, as a blazing lance of light erupted from one of the hovering tanks and hit the sentinel in the center of its canopy, passing straight through the walker. The sentinel's ammunition erupted into flame and it toppled onto its side before exploding. Dran's squad threw themselves to the ground as a hail of shrapnel and fire washed over them. Irons made use of the conflagration and obscuring smoke cloud to move, scrambling over debris, corpses, and broken armor glass. Garrett and Dran rose to provide covering fire, snapping off lasgun bursts at any Xenos foolish enough to emerge from hiding. Orvon crouched low, hands over the headset of his Vox unit, bellowing status reports to company command. Heaving his melter gun, Irons dragged himself to cover behind a deactivated plasma conduit and raised the weapon, resting its cooling shroud atop a conduit and centering it on the armored vehicle. Ignoring the blizzard of fire spinning towards him, he fired. The air hissed as a beam of superheated energy erupted from the melter gun towards the graceful skimmer tank. The first shot missed, fizzing over the canopy of the target. The miss had given away Iron's position. Xenos warriors pointed in his direction and began turning their weapons upon him. Gerrit and Dran continued to fire upon the foes, forcing them to keep their heads down. Irons ignored the hail of incoming fire and loosed another melter beam. This one struck home. Energy shields flickered and died as the beam burned its way through and struck the vehicle's armor. The hovering transport tank plummeted, striking the ground with a loud crash. Gouts of flames flickered from a smoldering hole in its hull. But any sense of triumph was fleeting. One of the Xenos' weapon platforms had locked onto Irons' position. A blizzard of shimmering projectiles burst from its barrel and scythed towards the exposed trooper. Blood sprayed from a dozen wounds as the alien ammunition sliced neatly through flak armor and flesh before burying itself into the walls. Iron's body toppled backwards into the dust, his melter gun falling to the ground beside him. The Xenos immediately turned their attention towards the rest of the squad. The sword-wielding enemies danced forward, their seemingly insubstantial armor absorbing or deflecting the few lasgun rounds that found their mark. Dran let out a loud curse as one of the foes vaulted over the rubble covering the entrance to the bunker and landed before the three guardsmen. Gerrit froze as the warrior bounded forward. The assailant lunged, blade outstretched, and with a casual flick of his wrist, decapitated him. His lasgun fell from lifeless hands, and his corpse slumped to the ground. Dran backpedaled towards the bunker's broken doorway, firing from the hip as he sought to escape. Proximity prevented the Xenos warrior from dodging. Several lasgun rounds burned straight through its armor, and it fell. Dran fumbled numbly for another power pack, trying his best not to look at Gerrit's corpse. As soon as the dead alien's body hit the floor, more of its kind cleared the rubble and burst into the hab bunker. Shoving Dran out of the doorway, Orvan took a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and tossed it into the bunker. The opponents darted back to avoid the explosion. Dran and Orvan made use of the momentary distraction to exit the structure just as the explosive detonated. A shower of rubble and dust erupted from within. Orvan's Vox unit crackled. "Reinforcements inbound! All forces, fall back to the secondary defensive line!" a static-laden voice exclaimed. Orvan rose first, extending a hand to drag Dran to his feet. They backpedaled, firing to hold the Xenos back. Others were in full retreat now, dozens of Cadian soldiers fleeing their overrun positions. High above, alien aircraft roared through the clouds before screaming towards a battlefield and strafing the guardsmen with their laser weapons. Glowing shrapnel fell in all directions, the hail of shimmering projectiles intensifying as the swift Xenos gained on the retreating guardsmen. Dran felt a flash of agony in his left leg. Ignoring it, he continued sprinting hard. Streaking jet bikes swept into view, their white chassis glistening in the blazing sunlight. They swept down with quicksilver speed, riders leveling long lances. Dran threw himself to the ground as they passed, feeling the heat of their engine flare wash over him. One of the riders angled towards Orvan, who continued to sprint in a futile attempt to escape. The rider's lance struck him in the back, a flash of light emitting from its tip. He folded up mid-sprint, rolling across the dusty ground, Vox unit erupting in a shower of sparks. The riders wheeled away, leaving scores of dead soldiers in their wake. Dran scrambled forward. The next line of defense lay no more than a few feet ahead. He could see the standard of the Cadian 66th fluttering in the breeze. Behind a series of Aegis defense barriers, a hardened core of survivors held firm. A regimental preacher stood in their midst, reliquary raised aloft, auto-pistol clasped in gnarled hands. The toothless zealot cried out to the fleeing Cadians, "Flee not in the face of death, for the Emperor blesses the martyr and shuns the craven." Dran scrambled into cover behind the barrier, heart pounding. He reached for the Aquila pendant, fastened around his neck, and clasped it tightly in his trembling hand. The priest's voice rang out again, loud and clear. "Hold, warriors of Cadia! Hold in the name of the Emperor! Dran released his Aquila. He took a deep breath, swallowing the fear, purging the doubt from his mind. The priest's words hardening his resolve. He would hold the line, for the Emperor, and for those that had fallen this day. He raised his gun, sighting the Xenos, and with a whispered prayer, opened fire. End quote. Again, my apologies for this being so brief, but rest assured, all of your favourite, self-written ongoing plotlines will continue, from Cronan and the Inquisitors to tankers and more. I still have so much to tell you. So, stick with me, and you shall be rewarded with many a banquet of lore in this 2025. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. Like and subscribe, tip if you feel that I have earned your bounty. But most importantly of all, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.